The Book of Job. You know the plot. Good man suffers, stays patient, gets rewarded in the end. But here's what they don't teach often: Job sues God. That's the actual book. Everything else is just the trial. I know how that sounds, but every Sunday school lesson, every patience of Job meme, every well meaning devotional has told you this is a book about enduring hardship. And sure, that's in there, but that's not actually what the book is doing at the structural level. What we definitely don't have here is a simple morality tale where a good man gets tested and passes the test. What we definitely don't have is God explaining himself, giving Job a neat theological answer for why bad things happen to good people. And what we definitely don't have is Job's friends being total idiots the whole time. A lot of what they say is actually orthodox, textbook wisdom theology. So, if it's not a simple test and it's not a divine Q&A session, what is the book of Job actually doing? Scholars like Robert Alter and Meredith Kline have both pointed out something that changes how you read this entire book. Job is written like a lawsuit, a courtroom drama. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. I promise you, this case gets stranger with every chapter. Before we get to Job the man, we need to understand something about the world the ancient Israelite audience lived in. And that's the world of covenant lawsuits. This might sound like a strange place to start, but this one piece of background is what's gonna make the ending of this video actually make sense. In the ancient Near East, when a covenant was broken, say a vassal betrayed his king, there was a recognized legal genre for confronting that betrayal. Scholars call it the rib pattern, from the Hebrew word for lawsuit. Old Testament scholar Delbert documented this pattern extensively, and Meredith Kline built on it, showing how prophets like Isaiah and Micah used this exact legal form when God brings charges against Israel. There's a plaintiff, a defendant, an appeal to witnesses, an indictment, and a verdict. This isn't just poetic flourish, it's the actual shape of ancient legal proceedings. Now hold that thought, because the book of Job opens with a scene that legal scholars and Hebrew Bible scholars alike have long recognized as a courtroom. Look at chapter 1. We're not on earth, we're in the heavenly council, the sod as it's called elsewhere in scripture, where the sons of God present themselves before the Lord. And among them comes a figure called Satan. Here's where I need to clear up a massive misunderstanding, because pop culture has completely warped this word. But before I tell you what it actually means, I want you to sit with what this figure is about to do to Job, because it is colder and more calculated than anything you've heard in a sermon. Satan in Hebrew isn't a proper name in Job, it's a title, and it literally means the accuser or the adversary. Tremper, Longman III, and John Walton both stress this point. In the prologue, this figure functions like a prosecuting attorney in God's court. His job, quite literally, is to roam the earth, building a legal case against humanity's integrity. He's not the horned pitchfork welding devil of later folklore, he's a courtroom prosecutor with a legal brief. And what's the brief he brings against Job? It's beautifully cynical, honestly. God, sitting as judge, essentially calls Job as Exhibit A of human righteousness. And the accuser responds with a legal challenge. Does Job fear God for nothing? In other words, Job's righteousness is a transaction. Take away the blessings and you'll expose the fraud. And God does something no defense attorney would ever advise. He agrees to the wager. So, already in chapter 1, before Job has lost a single sheep, we are sitting in a courtroom. There is a judge, there is a prosecutor, there is a defendant who doesn't even know he's on trial yet. And here's what nobody tells you: Job never finds out about this wager. Not in this chapter, not by the end of the book. He goes to his grave never knowing why any of this happened to him. Keep that in the back of your mind because it's going to matter a lot more later than you think. Job loses everything: his children, his wealth, his health, and for 7 days his 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, sit with him in silence. That silence, by the way, is actually the correct ancient Near Eastern mourning custom. They start out doing everything right, but then they open their mouths. And the courtroom drama shifts into its second phase, what scholars like Norman Habel call the disputation cycle. And this is crucial. The dialogue sections of Job, chapters 3 through 31, aren't just casual conversation. Habel and others have shown that the language throughout these chapters is saturated with legal vocabulary. Job repeatedly demands a rib, a formal legal case, against God. He wants a mediator, an arbiter, someone to lay a hand on both parties, as he says in chapter 9. He wants to present his case and have it heard. Meanwhile, his friends function almost like prosecution witnesses testifying to a theology they assume must be true. Suffering is always the result of sin. Therefore, Job must have sinned. And here's the uncomfortable part: this wasn't a fringe view, it's a legitimate and largely accurate summary of the wisdom tradition found throughout Proverbs. Francis Andersen, in his Tyndale commentary, makes a point of defending the Friends' basic theology as orthodox. Their error isn't in believing sin brings consequences. Their error is applying a general principle universally, as if it explains every single case without exception, and then using it to prosecute Job without evidence. In legal terms, they are arguing from circumstantial inference without any actual testimony or proof. They're a prosecution built entirely on precedent. Job refuses to plead guilty to a crime he knows he hasn't committed, and so the trial escalates, all the way to a chapter that most viewers skip over, but that scholars consider one of the most legally significant passages in the entire Old Testament. By chapter 31, we reach what David Clines identifies as a formal legal document: Job's Oath of Innocence. This chapter reads almost exactly like an ancient Near Eastern self-curse oath, where the accused swears innocence to a long list of specific charges: dishonesty, adultery, injustice to servants, neglect of the poor, and invites divine judgment upon himself if he's lying on any count. This isn't poetic venting. This is Job filing a formal legal deposition, daring the case to be heard. Job has just done everything a defendant can legally do. He's sworn the oath, he's demanded a trial. There's nothing left for him to do but wait for the verdict. Except that's not what happens next. What happens next is something no one in the courtroom was expecting. A young man named Elihu bursts in, uninvited, unannounced, and furious at everyone in the room. Elihu hasn't spoken this whole time, and now he can't hold back. Scholars are genuinely divided on how to read him. Some, like Longman, see him as a transitional voice, a bridge that sets up the coming speeches of God by emphasizing God's transcendence. Others read him more critically, as another long-winded voice adding to the noise rather than resolving it. Either way, in courtroom terms, Elihu functions almost like a surprise witness, insisting he alone truly understands justice, while the actual judge is still sitting silently. And then, mid sentence, Elihu stops talking about justice and starts talking about storms. He describes thunder, lightning, wind. He's building, almost like he senses something is coming. And he's right, because behind him, the sky has started to change. Out of the whirlwind, God speaks. And here's the twist that makes this the most theologically stunning courtroom scene in ancient literature. God doesn't answer the charges. He doesn't explain the wager from chapter 1, the one Job never even knew about. He doesn't give Job a tidy explanation for his suffering. Instead, God does something no one in that courtroom, and probably nobody watching this video, saw coming. He puts Job back on the stand. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Chapter after chapter, God parades the cosmos, the animal kingdom, the wild and untamable corners of creation, Behemoth, Leviathan, in front of Job, essentially asking, do you have the wisdom and power to even understand the case you're demanding I answer? John Walton argues that this isn't God dodging the question. It's God reframing what the real question even is. The book was never ultimately about whether retribution theology is airtight. It's about whether God's governance of the universe can be trusted even when his reasons stay hidden. And here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. Job never gets his answer. Not one word about the wager, not one explanation for the suffering. And Job stops demanding one anyway. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Job withdraws his lawsuit, not because he's been defeated with an argument, but because he's been confronted with a person. The case that took 31 chapters to build gets dropped in a single sentence. But dropping the lawsuit isn't the end of this story, because a courtroom drama can't just end when the plaintiff walks away. It needs an actual verdict. And what God says next is going to completely reverse who you think wins this case. God turns to Eliphaz and says something remarkable. My wrath is kindled against you and your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Think about that for a second. The friends, the ones who never lost their homes, their children, or their health, are the ones formally rebuked by the judge. And Job, the man who spent 31 chapters accusing God, demanding a trial and refusing to back down, is the one called my servant and vindicated. The friends are told to offer sacrifices, with Job interceding for them as a kind of priestly mediator. The very role he begged for back in chapter 9. He asked for a mediator to stand between him and God. Instead, he became one. And Job's fortunes are restored, not as a magic reward for good behavior, but as the final legal ruling in a case that has finally fully closed. So when you step back and read Job as a covenant lawsuit, a heavenly courtroom drama with a prosecutor, a defendant, expert witnesses who get it half right, a surprise witness, and finally the judge himself taking the stand, the whole book reads differently. It's not a book that hands you a tidy answer to a problem of suffering. It's a book that puts you in the gallery of a trial where the defendant is vindicated not by winning an argument, but by finally seeing the judge face to face. And maybe that's the most deeply Christian takeaway of all. Because none of us can fully argue our case before a holy God either. We don't need a clever legal defense. We need a mediator. And that longing Job had for someone to stand between him and God, someone to lay a hand on both parties, that longing doesn't stay unanswered forever. There's another trial in Scripture where a perfectly innocent defendant stands accused. And this time, he doesn't just intercede for the guilty. He takes the verdict himself. That's a courtroom I'm covering in a future video. So if you don't want to miss it, this is the moment to subscribe. Thank you for watching. Have a blessed day ahead.